The wind howled across the Montana plains like a hungry wolf searching for prey. Sarah Matthews pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood on the porch of her small cabin, watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon. The autumn of 1882 had been harsh, and winter was coming early this year. Her husband had been dead for 6 months now, taken by a fever that swept through their small settlement, leaving her alone with their cattle ranch and more debt than she could manage. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind, and Sarah squinted into the distance. A lone rider was approaching, hunched against the weather. As he drew closer, she could see he was a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing a worn leather coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His horse looked tired, and both rider and mount seemed to be struggling against the coming storm. The stranger reached her fence line and stopped. He touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice deep and rough from the cold. "I'm looking for work. Name's Jake Sullivan. Heard in town you might need help with your cattle." Sarah studied him carefully. "In this country, you learn to read people quickly or you didn't survive long." The man sat straight in his saddle despite his obvious exhaustion. His clothes were well worn but clean, and his horse, though tired, was well cared for. Most importantly, his eyes met hers directly when he spoke. She had learned to distrust men who wouldn't look her in the eye. "You heard right," she said, stepping down from the porch. "But I can't pay much. Lost most of my hands when my husband died. The ones that stayed left when the money ran short." Jake nodded, dismounting from his horse. "I'm not looking for much pay, ma'am. Just honest work, a place to sleep, and 3 meals a day. I've got my own gear and my own horse. Been working cattle since I was 12 years old." The first drops of rain began to fall, large and cold. Sarah made her decision quickly. "There's a bunkhouse out back. It's not much, but it's dry and warm. You can stable your horse in the barn. We'll talk terms in the morning." "Much obliged, ma'am." Jake led his horse toward the barn, then stopped and turned back. "Ma'am? The storm's going to be a bad one. You might want to make sure your shutters are secure." That evening, Sarah sat by her kitchen window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, bringing driving rain and wind that made the cabin creak and groan. She had taken Jake's advice about the shutters, and now she was grateful for it. Through the storm, she could see a faint light in the bunkhouse window, and somehow that small sign of another human presence made her feel less alone than she had in months. Around midnight, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin, followed immediately by a crash that made Sarah jump to her feet. She grabbed her lantern and peered out into the storm. A large tree branch had come down and smashed through the roof of the bunkhouse. In the flickering light of her lantern, she could see Jake standing in the doorway of the damaged building, rain soaking through his shirt. Without thinking, Sarah threw her shawl over her head and ran out into the storm. "Are you hurt?" she shouted over the wind. "I'm fine," Jake called back, "but the roof's got a hole big enough to drive a wagon through. I'll just ride it out in the barn with the horses." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah said. "You'll catch your death in this weather. Come inside." Jake hesitated. "Ma'am, that wouldn't be proper. People talk." "Let them talk," Sarah said firmly. "I won't have a man freeze to death on my property because of what the gossips might say. Besides, there's no one around for miles to see anything." She turned and hurried back toward the cabin, not waiting for his answer. After a moment, she heard his boots splashing through the mud behind her. Inside the warm, dry cabin, Jake stood dripping on the wooden floor, looking uncomfortable and out of place. Sarah handed him a towel and pointed to the chair by the fireplace. "Sit down before you catch pneumonia. I'll make some coffee." As she worked in the kitchen, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. In the lamplight, she could see that Jake was younger than she had first thought, probably in his early 30s. His dark hair was damp and tousled, and, despite his obvious discomfort at the situation, there was something steady and reliable about his presence that she found reassuring. "This is a fine place you have here," Jake said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. "Your husband built it himself?" Most of it, Sarah replied, settling into the chair across from him. He was good with his hands. Good at a lot of things. She paused, then added quietly, I miss him every day. Jake nodded respectfully. How long were you married? 8 years. We came out here right after we wed, full of dreams about building something together. Sarah stared into the fire. We wanted children, but... She let the sentence trail off. I'm sorry for your loss, Jake said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Finally, Jake spoke again. If you don't mind me asking, what are your plans? This is a good spread, but it's a lot for one person to handle. Sarah sighed. Honestly? I don't know. The bank's been patient so far, but they won't wait forever. I've got about 100 head of cattle, but I need help getting them to market before winter sets in. If I can make one good sale, I might be able to keep the place. What about your family? Any relatives who could help? My parents died when I was 17. That's when I met Thomas, my husband. He was working on a ranch near my hometown in Kansas. When he decided to come west, I came with him. Sarah managed a small smile. I guess you could say I'd been taking care of myself for a while now. Jake studied her face in the firelight. There was strength there, he could see it, but also weariness. This woman had been carrying a heavy load alone for too long. What kind of help did you have before? Thomas and I had 3 regular hands. Good men, all of them. But, after he died, I couldn't keep up with their wages. They were understanding about it, but a man's got to eat. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I've been trying to manage with just day workers when I can afford them, but it's not enough. 100 head is manageable with the right help, Jake said thoughtfully. What's the nearest market town? Billings. It's about a 4-day drive with cattle, if the weather holds. But I'd need at least 3 good riders to get them there safely. Jake leaned forward in his chair. Mrs. Matthews, I've got a proposition for you. I'm not just looking for day work. I'm looking to settle somewhere, maybe eventually buy some land of my own. What if we made a deal? I'll help you get your cattle to market, and, instead of wages, I take a percentage of the sale. If we do well, maybe we can work out something more permanent. Sarah looked at him carefully. What kind of percentage are you thinking? Fair split of whatever profit we make over your expenses and debt payments. I'm gambling my time and effort on your success. Seems right that I should share in it if things go well. It was a generous offer, almost too generous. Sarah had learned to be suspicious of men who offered too much too easily. Why would you do that? You don't even know if I can manage a cattle drive. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, I've been drifting for 2 years now, ever since I lost my own place to drought and bad luck. I'm tired of moving on every few months. This place, this land, it feels like somewhere a man could put down roots. And you. He met her eyes directly. You strike me as someone worth taking a chance on. The wind rattled the windows, and Sarah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When was the last time someone had believed in her abilities? Thomas had been a good husband, but he had always been the one to make the big decisions, the one everyone looked to for leadership. The idea that this stranger saw something in her worth betting on was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd want references, she said finally. And we'd need to draw up papers, make everything legal and proper. Jake nodded. Of course. I can give you the names of 3 ranchers I've worked for in the past 2 years. All good men who'll speak honestly about my abilities. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the storm. The rain was starting to ease up, but the wind was still strong. The weather's clearing. You could probably make it back to the bunkhouse if you wanted to try to patch that roof. Jake stood as well, setting his empty coffee cup on the table. He walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, he said quietly, Mrs. Matthews? I know this situation isn't exactly proper, me being here alone with you. If you're uncomfortable, I understand. But, I want you to know that you're safe with me. I would never take advantage of a woman's kindness, especially not a widow trying to keep her home. Sarah turned from the window to look at him. In the lamplight, his profile was strong and honest. She realized that for the first time in months, she felt truly safe. Not just physically safe, but something deeper than that. Safe enough to hope. "Mr. Sullivan," she said softly. He turned to face her, and their eyes met across the small room. "The storm's not over yet," she continued, her heart beating faster. "And that roof won't be any drier in an hour than it is now." Jake stood very still. "What are you saying, ma'am?" Sarah took a breath, feeling as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff. "I'm saying that maybe propriety isn't the most important thing tonight. Maybe what's important is that we're both tired of being alone." The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities and unspoken questions. Outside, the wind was dying down, but inside the cabin, Sarah felt as though a different kind of storm was just beginning. Jake took a step toward her, then stopped. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I need you to be sure about this. Because if you ask me to stay, really stay, I'm not sure I'll be able to leave when morning comes." Sarah felt a flutter of fear mixed with something she hadn't felt in a very long time, desire. Not just physical desire, though she felt that too, but a deeper longing for connection, for partnership, for someone to share the burden and the hope. "I'm not asking you to leave," she whispered. Jake crossed the room slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When he reached her, he stopped just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his cheek. Jake closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. "I've been alone for so long," she said quietly. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone to stay." Jake opened his eyes and looked down at her. "I've been alone longer than you know. But, standing here now, with you, I can't remember why I thought that was what I wanted." He reached up and covered her hand with his, pressing her palm against his cheek. "Sarah, if we do this, everything changes. You know that, don't you?" "Maybe everything needs to change," she replied. Jake moved his hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing gently across her cheekbone. "I meant what I said about settling down, about putting down roots. But, I want you to know that it's not just about the land anymore." "What's it about then?" "It's about you," he said simply. "It's about the way you stood up to that storm tonight, the way you offered shelter to a stranger, the way you're brave enough to take a chance on something new even when you're scared." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. When had anyone last seen her so clearly? "Jake," she murmured. "Yes?" She took a shaky breath. "May I ask you to stay tonight?" Jake's answer came without hesitation, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Yes. God, yes." As he leaned down to kiss her, Sarah thought that maybe the storm hadn't been trying to destroy something tonight. Maybe it had been trying to bring something new into her life. Something she hadn't even known she was hoping for. The wind outside had finally died to a whisper, but inside the cabin, a new chapter was just beginning. Dawn came slowly to the Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window and the unfamiliar but comforting sensation of strong arms around her. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, listening to Jake's steady breathing and trying to process what had happened between them. In the soft morning light, the previous night felt like a dream. Had she really asked this stranger to stay? Had she really felt so safe, so desired, so alive in his arms? The memory of his gentle hands and whispered words made her cheeks flush warm. Jake stirred beside her, and Sarah felt him tense as he became aware of where he was. She turned in his arms to face him, studying his expression in the early morning light. His dark eyes were uncertain, almost worried. "Good morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied, his voice husky with sleep. "Sarah, about last night. I want you to know that I don't take what happened between us lightly." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his morning stubble. Neither do I, Jake. I need you to understand something. I wasn't thinking clearly last night because I was lonely or scared. I was thinking clearly because for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Relief flooded his features, and he pulled her closer. I was worried you might regret it in the daylight. The only thing I regret, Sarah said, tracing her finger along his collarbone, is that morning had to come so soon. Jake captured her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm tenderly. We have work to do today. That roof won't fix itself, and your cattle won't move themselves to market. Sarah sighed, knowing he was right. The harsh realities of frontier life didn't pause for romance, no matter how wonderful it might be. How long do you think it will take to get them ready for the drive? Depends on their condition and how scattered they are. We'll need to round them up, check them over, and separate out any that aren't strong enough for the journey. Jake sat up, running his hand through his tousled hair. First thing, though, I need to ride into town and send those telegrams to my references. You'll want to check my story before we make any formal agreements. Sarah appreciated his straightforward approach to business, but she found herself reluctant to let him leave, even for a few hours. What if people in town start asking questions about why you're working for me? Let them ask. We'll tell them the truth, that I'm helping you get your cattle to market in exchange for a share of the profits. That's a common enough arrangement. Jake pulled on his shirt and turned to face her. Sarah, I want to be clear about something. What happened between us last night was real, and I hope it's the beginning of something lasting. But our business arrangement has to be separate from our personal feelings. I won't have anyone saying I took advantage of a widow's vulnerability. Sarah sat up, pulling the blanket around herself. You're right. We need to be careful about appearances, at least until we know where this is all leading. Do you want to know where I hope it's leading? Jake asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Tell me. I hope it's leading to a partnership. In business and in life. I hope it's leading to me earning the right to court you properly, and maybe someday to marry you. He paused, then added quietly, I hope it's leading to us building something together that will last. Sarah felt her heart racing. It was too soon for such serious talk, but she couldn't deny that the same hopes were growing in her own heart. That's a lot to hope for based on one night. Maybe. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and my instincts tell me you're the kind of woman a man waits his whole life to find. Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Jake was instantly alert, moving to the window to look outside. 2 riders coming in fast, he said, reaching for his gun belt. Do you recognize them? Sarah joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the approaching figures. It's Ben Morrison and his son Frank. They own the spread to the north of here. Friends of yours? Hardly. Ben's been trying to buy my land ever since Thomas died. He's made several offers, each one lower than the last. Sarah began dressing quickly. He thinks I'm too weak to manage on my own, and he's been waiting for me to fail so he can buy the place for practically nothing. Jake's expression hardened. What kind of man is he? The kind who thinks a woman alone is easy prey. He's not violent, but he's persistent and condescending. And his son Frank. Sarah shuddered. Frank thinks he's God's gift to women, especially vulnerable widows. Well, they're about to learn different, Jake said grimly, strapping on his gun belt. By the time Ben and Frank Morrison reached the front porch, Sarah was fully dressed and Jake was standing slightly behind her, his presence both protective and respectful. The 2 Morrison men dismounted, and Sarah noticed how their eyes immediately went to Jake, sizing him up. Ben Morrison was a big man in his 50s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes. His son Frank was younger and flashier, with an oily smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. Both men carried themselves with the arrogance of those who had never been seriously challenged. Morning, Sarah, Ben said, tipping his hat but keeping his eyes on Jake. Didn't expect to find you had company. Good morning, Ben. Frank. Sarah kept her voice level and businesslike. What brings you by so early? Actually, we were riding the boundary line and noticed some of your cattle had wandered onto our land again, Frank said with a smirk. Seems like you're having trouble keeping track of your stock. Jake stepped forward slightly. Cattle wander. It happens to every rancher. Are you saying you've never had to retrieve strays from neighboring land? Frank's eyes narrowed. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Frank Morrison, and this is my father Ben. We own the Double M Ranch. Jake Sullivan, Jake replied, not offering his hand. I'm helping Mrs. Matthews with her cattle operation. Ben laughed harshly. Helping her? With what money? Last I heard, Sarah couldn't afford to keep the hands she had. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but Jake's calm voice cut through her rage. Mrs. Matthews and I have a business arrangement that works for both of us. As for the wandering cattle, we'd be happy to retrieve them at your convenience. Business arrangement? Frank's tone was mocking. What kind of business arrangement does a pretty widow make with a drifter? The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah saw Jake's hand move almost imperceptibly toward his gun, but his voice remained steady. The kind that's none of your business, Morrison. Ben stepped forward, clearly trying to diffuse the tension before it escalated. Now, hold on. There's no need for hostility here. Sarah, I actually came by to make you another offer for your spread. A generous one. I've told you before, Ben. This place isn't for sale. Be reasonable, Sarah. You can't possibly manage a cattle ranch by yourself, and hiring help you can't afford isn't going to solve your problems long term. Ben's tone was patronizing. I'm prepared to offer you $3,000 for the entire spread, land, buildings, and livestock. Sarah gasped. 3,000? Ben, this land alone is worth more than that, and you know it. Maybe it was when cattle prices were high and you had a husband to help you work it. But times change, Sarah. The market's not what it was, and, frankly, neither is this place. Jake spoke up quietly. What was this place worth when Mr. Matthews was alive? Sarah answered reluctantly. Thomas always said it was worth at least 8,000, maybe 10 if cattle prices stayed strong. And what are cattle prices like now? Jake asked Ben directly. Ben shifted uncomfortably. Well, they've dropped some, but how much? Jake pressed. Maybe 20%, Frank interjected. Jake nodded thoughtfully. So even with a 20% drop in cattle prices, this place should still be worth $6,000 or $7,000. Yet you're offering $3,000. That's quite a discount for a distressed sale. Ben's face reddened. You don't know anything about this market, Sullivan. Or this land. That place has been running downhill since Thomas died. From what I can see, Mrs. Matthews has been maintaining her property quite well under difficult circumstances, Jake replied evenly. The buildings are in good repair, the fences are solid, and the cattle look healthy. You've been here one night, Frank sneered. What could you possibly know about the condition of this place? Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I know enough to recognize when someone's trying to take advantage of a vulnerable woman. And I know enough to make sure that doesn't happen. The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Frank's hand moved toward his gun, but Ben grabbed his son's arm. That's enough, Frank. Ben turned back to Sarah. My offer stands, Sarah. $3,000, cash, and you can be free of all this worry and responsibility. Think about it. I don't need to think about it, Sarah replied firmly. My answer is the same as it's always been. No. Ben mounted his horse, his face dark with anger. You're making a mistake, Sarah. Winter's coming, and you're not prepared for it. When this drifter moves on and leaves you high and dry, don't come crying to me. Mr. Morrison, Jake said quietly, I'd be careful about making predictions about what I will or won't do. You might find yourself disappointed. After the Morrison men had ridden away, Sarah slumped against the porch railing. I'm sorry you had to see that. Ben's been pressuring me for months, and, Frank. She shuddered. Frank what? Jake's voice was dangerous. He's made it clear that he thinks marriage to him would solve all my problems. He's persistent in his attentions. Jake was quiet for a long moment, then said, Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Have either of those men ever threatened you or made you feel unsafe? Sarah hesitated. Not exactly threatened, but... Frank came by alone a few weeks ago when I was working in the barn. He cornered me and tried to kiss me. When I pushed him away, he said I was being foolish, that I needed a man to take care of me and he was willing to do it. Jake's jaw tightened. Did he hurt you? No, I managed to get away from him. But, the way he looked at me. It was like he thought I owed him something because I'm alone. You don't owe him anything. You don't owe anyone anything. Jake turned to face her fully. Sarah, I want you to promise me something. If either of those men come around when I'm not here, don't face them alone. Go inside, bar the door, and, if necessary, use that rifle I saw hanging over the fireplace. You think they might try something more serious? I think Ben Morrison is a man who's used to getting what he wants, and he doesn't like being told no. Frank strikes me as the type who thinks women exist for his convenience. Jake paused. But, more than that, I think our being together last night may have changed the situation. What do you mean? I mean that Ben was counting on you being isolated and desperate enough to eventually accept his offer. Now that you have help, even temporary help, his timeline has changed. He might decide to apply more pressure. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. You think I've made things worse by asking you to stay? Jake took her hands in his. No, Sarah. You've made things better in every way that matters. But, you need to understand that men like the Morrisons don't give up easily. We need to be prepared for them to escalate their tactics. What do you suggest we do? First, we send those telegrams and get my references confirmed. Then, we draw up a formal partnership agreement and file it with the county clerk. That will make our business relationship official and legal. Jake squeezed her hands. And, then, we get your cattle to market as fast as possible and show everyone in the territory that Sarah Matthews is not a woman to be underestimated. Sarah felt a surge of determination. You're right. I've been defending when I should have been attacking. Now you're thinking like a rancher, Jake said with approval. But, first things first. I need to fix that roof, check on your cattle, and ride into town. Are you comfortable staying here alone for a few hours? I'll be fine. I've been alone for months, remember? Jake cupped her face in his hands. You're not alone anymore, Sarah. Whatever happens, whatever we face, you're not alone. As he kissed her softly, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in her world. She was no longer just fighting to survive, she was fighting to build a future. And, for the first time since Thomas died, she believed she had a real chance of winning. Jake returned from town just after noon, his face grim as he dismounted near the barn. Sarah had spent the morning mending harnesses and checking supplies, but she could tell immediately that his trip hadn't gone well. What happened? She asked, setting down her work. The telegrams are sent, but that's about the only good news. Jake removed his hat and ran his hand through his hair. I stopped by the bank to introduce myself and let them know about our partnership. The bank president, Mr. Hartwell, made it clear that the Morrisons have been in to see him recently. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What did Ben tell him? According to Hartwell, Ben expressed concern about your ability to meet your loan payments. He suggested that the bank might want to consider calling in your note early, before you default and leave them with worthless property. But, I'm not behind on my payments, Sarah protested. I've been making the minimum payments every month since Thomas died. I know, and Hartwell acknowledged that. But, he also made it clear that minimum payments aren't enough to satisfy the full debt, and the bank is getting nervous about carrying so much risk on frontier properties. Jake's expression darkened. What he didn't say, but what I could read between the lines, is that the Morrisons have offered to buy your debt from the bank at a discount. Sarah sank onto a bale of hay, the full implications hitting her. If they buy my debt, they can call it in whenever they want. They could demand full payment immediately. Exactly. And, when you can't pay, they get the property for the amount of the outstanding loan, which is probably a fraction of what it's really worth. How much time do we have? Jake sat down beside her. Hartwell wouldn't commit to a timeline, but he hinted that the bank's board meets at the end of next week. If we're going to do something, it needs to be soon. Sarah felt the familiar weight of desperation settling on her shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by a burning anger. They're trying to steal my home. Thomas worked himself to death building this place, and they want to steal it. They're not going to succeed, Jake said firmly. But we need to move fast. How quickly can we gather your cattle and get them to market? Under normal circumstances? 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather turns bad. Sarah stood and began pacing. But if we push hard and take some risks. What kind of risks? We could gather them faster by using fewer men over a wider area. It's dangerous if someone gets thrown or lost, there might not be help nearby. And we'd have to move them to market immediately, without taking time to rest them or wait for the best prices. Jake nodded thoughtfully. What's the bare minimum crew you'd need for a drive to Billings? 3 experienced riders, including myself. 4 would be safer, but 3 could do it if they were good. Where are we going to find 2 more riders willing to work for a share of uncertain profits? Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, her face brightened. Charlie Hawkins and Miguel Santos. They worked for us last year before I had to let them go. They're good men, and I know they're still in the area because I saw Charlie in town last month. Will they be willing to work for shares instead of wages? Charlie might. He's got a small place of his own, but it's barely supporting him. Miguel's got a wife and baby, so he'll need some cash up front. Sarah did quick calculations in her head. I could probably scrape together $50 for Miguel, and promise Charlie and you equal shares of the profits after expenses. Jake stood and moved to the window, looking out at the distant pastures where Sarah's cattle grazed. How many head do you think we can gather? I'd estimate about 80 head that are in good condition for travel. The rest are either too young, too old, or not healthy enough for the drive. What price are you expecting in Billings? Last I heard, good beef cattle were bringing around $18 to $20 a head. But prices fluctuate, and we won't know for sure until we get there. Jake did the math quickly. 80 head at $18 would be $1,440. After paying off Miguel and covering trail expenses, we might clear $1,200. Is that enough to satisfy the bank? Sarah's heart sank. The outstanding loan balance is almost $2,000. Even a good sale won't be enough to pay it off completely. But it would be enough to show good faith and buy us time to sell the rest of the herd, Jake pointed out. If you can make a substantial payment and show the bank that you have a viable plan for paying off the rest, they'll be less likely to sell your debt to the Morrisons. It was a thin hope, but it was hope nonetheless. Sarah squared her shoulders. Then, we'd better get started. Can you ride out and find Charlie and Miguel while I begin gathering supplies for the drive? Where am I likely to find them? Charlie has a claim about 10 miles east of here, near Willow Creek. Miguel was working for the Double Bar Ranch last I heard, but that was 2 months ago. Sarah paused. Jake, I need to warn you about something. If Ben Morrison finds out what we're planning, he might try to interfere. How? He could spread word that we're moving stolen cattle, or that our partnership agreement isn't legal. He's got influence in the county, and he could cause us serious problems if he wanted to. Jake's expression was grim but determined. Then, we'll have to be smarter and faster than he is. Sarah, I need you to think carefully about this. Once we start gathering those cattle, there's no turning back. If something goes wrong, if we lose the herd or can't get a good price, you could lose everything. Sarah looked around at the cabin and land that represented everything she and Thomas had worked for. Then, she looked at Jake, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. "I've already lost everything that truly mattered to me once," she said quietly. "I won't let it happen again, not without a fight. And now I have something worth fighting for beyond just the land." Jake's eyes softened. "What's that?" "I have a partner. I have someone who believes in me and believes we can build something together." Sarah moved closer to him. "Jake, whatever happens with the cattle drive, I want you to know that last night changed everything for me. Not just because of the physical closeness, but because for the first time since Thomas died, I remembered what it felt like to have hope." Jake pulled her into his arms. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I haven't been completely honest about my past." Sarah's heart stuttered with fear. "What do you mean?" "I told you I lost my place to drought and bad luck, and that's true. But there's more to it." Jake took a deep breath. "I was married before. My wife died in childbirth 3 years ago, along with our baby. After that, I couldn't bear to stay on the land we'd worked together, so I sold everything and started drifting." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed quickly by sympathy. "Oh, Jake. I'm so sorry. What I'm trying to say is that I understand what it's like to lose everything that matters, to feel like you're just going through the motions of living without really being alive." Jake cupped her face in his hands. "But being here with you, planning for the future instead of just surviving day to day. You've reminded me what it means to truly live again." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "We've both lost so much. But we've found each other. And that means we have a chance to build something new, something that honors what we've lost while still moving forward." They held each other for a long moment, drawing strength from their shared understanding of loss and hope. Finally, Jake pulled back. "I should go find Charlie and Miguel. The sooner we get started, the better our chances. Be careful. And, Jake? If you run into any of Morrison's men while you're out there, don't turn your back on them." Jake kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before dark." After Jake left, Sarah threw herself into preparations for the cattle drive. She checked and organized supplies, mended gear, and made lists of everything they would need for the journey to Billings. As she worked, she found herself thinking about what Jake had told her about his wife and child. The pain in his voice when he spoke of them had been unmistakable, and she understood now why he had seemed so careful about making promises about the future. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah heard horses approaching again. Her heart leaped, hoping Jake had returned early, but when she looked out the window, she saw Frank Morrison riding up alone. Her blood ran cold. Sarah quickly moved to the gun rack and took down the rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. She didn't intend to shoot anyone, but she wasn't going to be caught defenseless either. Frank dismounted and walked up to the porch with his characteristic swagger, apparently oblivious to the weapon in Sarah's hands. "Afternoon, Sarah," he called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it? What do you want, Frank?" Sarah kept the rifle visible but not pointed directly at him. "Now, is that any way to greet a neighbor? I just came by to check on you, make sure you're doing all right after our visit this morning." "I'm fine, thank you. You can go now." Frank stepped up onto the porch, moving closer than Sarah was comfortable with. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking about your situation. This arrangement you have with that drifter, it's not going to work out the way you think it is. My arrangements are none of your business." "See, that's where you're wrong." Frank's tone remained conversational, but there was an edge to it now. "Men like Jake Sullivan don't stick around. They take what they can get and move on. And, when he does, you're going to be in an even worse position than you are now." Sarah raised the rifle slightly. "I think it's time for you to leave, Frank." Frank ignored the weapon, apparently confident that she wouldn't actually use it. "My father's offer is still good, Sarah. $3,000, cash. But that offer might not last much longer, especially if word gets around that you're entertaining strange men in your home." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt her temper flare. "Are you threatening to spread lies about me?" "I don't need to spread lies. I just need to tell people what I've observed. A widow woman, all alone, taking in a strange man. People draw their own conclusions." "Get off my property," Sarah said, raising the rifle to her shoulder. "Now." Frank laughed. "You're not going to shoot me, Sarah. You're too much of a lady for that." "Maybe. But I'll bet you don't want to test that theory." For the first time, Frank seemed to notice that she was serious. He held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. I'm going." "But, Sarah? You might want to think real carefully about the choices you're making. This is a small community, and a woman's reputation is a fragile thing." After Frank rode away, Sarah sat down heavily on the porch steps, the rifle across her knees. She was shaking, not from fear but from rage. How dare he come to her home and threaten her reputation? How dare he assume he had any right to judge her choices? But beneath the anger was a cold fear. Frank was right about one thing: a woman's reputation was fragile in frontier communities. If the Morrisons started spreading rumors about her relationship with Jake, it could make their situation much more difficult. When Jake returned an hour later with Charlie Hawkins riding beside him, Sarah was still sitting on the porch with the rifle. "What happened?" Jake asked immediately, dismounting quickly. Sarah told him about Frank's visit, watching Jake's face grow darker with each detail. Charlie, a weathered man in his 40s with kind eyes and calloused hands, listened with growing anger. "That boy needs a lesson in manners," Charlie said when she finished. "Frank Morrison's always been trouble," Jake agreed. "But this changes things. If they're willing to attack your reputation to get what they want, we need to be even more careful about how we proceed." "Did you find Miguel?" Sarah asked. "Charlie thinks he knows where Miguel is working now. We're going to ride out first thing in the morning to talk to him." Jake sat down beside Sarah on the steps. "Charlie's agreed to our terms, by the way." "I appreciate the opportunity, Mrs. Matthews," Charlie said respectfully. "Times have been lean, and the chance to earn a good share of profits is more valuable than wages right now." "Jake told me about the time pressure we're under," Sarah said. "Are you sure you're willing to take the risk?" Charlie nodded. "I've known you and your husband for years. If Tom Matthews trusted this land enough to put everything he had into it, then it's worth fighting for." As they planned their strategy for the next day, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. They had a plan, they had help, and they had each other. But they also had dangerous enemies who wouldn't hesitate to destroy her reputation and her future to get what they wanted. The battle for her home was about to begin in earnest. 3 days later, Sarah sat on her horse watching the sun rise over a scene that would have been impossible to imagine just a week ago. 83 head of cattle moved slowly across the grassland, guided by 4 riders who had become more than just business partners. They had become a family of choice, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. Miguel Santos had agreed to join their venture, and his wife Rosa had packed enough food for the journey to Billings. The $50 Sarah had scraped together would feed Miguel's family for 2 months, and the promise of a share in the profits had put hope back in his dark eyes. Jake rode point, his hat tilted against the morning sun as he guided the herd along the trail. Charlie flanked the cattle on the right, while Miguel took the left flank. Sarah brought up the rear, watching for strays and keeping an eye on the horizon behind them. The first day of the drive had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly. They had made good time, and the cattle were behaving well. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Twice she had seen riders on distant ridges, always too far away to identify but close enough to be tracking their progress. "Trouble?" Jake asked, riding back to check on her. "Maybe. We've had company following us since we left the ranch." Jake's eyes scanned the horizon. "Morrison's men?" "That would be my guess. They're staying well back, but they're definitely keeping pace with us." "What do you think they're planning?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question all morning. "I don't know. Maybe they're just gathering information about our route and timing. Or maybe they're waiting for the right moment to cause trouble. Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "How well do you know the country between here and Billings?" "Well enough. Thomas and I made this drive several times over the years." Sarah pointed toward a line of hills in the distance. "There's a narrow canyon about 10 miles ahead where the trail passes between high rock walls. It's the only practical route through that area, but it's also the perfect place for an ambush." "How long is the canyon?" "About 2 miles from end to end, with steep walls on both sides. Once you're in there with a herd this size, there's no turning back quickly." Jake studied the terrain ahead, his expression thoughtful. "We need to assume they're planning something for that canyon. The question is, what can we do about it?" "We could take the long way around, add 3 days to our journey," Sarah suggested, though she knew they couldn't afford the extra time. "Or we could spring their trap before they're ready for us," Jake said quietly. "What do you mean?" "I mean we could force them to make their move in a place of our choosing, instead of waiting for them to choose the time and place." Sarah felt a chill of excitement mixed with fear. "That's extremely risky. So is letting them dictate the terms of this fight?" Jake's eyes met hers. "Sarah, these men aren't going to give up. Even if we make it to Billings and sell the cattle, they'll find another way to pressure you. The only way to end this is to face them head-on and show them that you're not someone they can intimidate or manipulate." Sarah thought about Frank Morrison's threats about her reputation, about Ben Morrison's arrogant assumption that she would eventually give up and sell to him. Jake was right, this wasn't just about getting cattle to market. This was about establishing her right to live her own life and make her own choices. "What do you have in mind?" she asked. Jake outlined his plan as they rode. It was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and a great deal of trust between all 4 riders. But it also had the advantage of surprise and the moral authority that came from defending their legitimate business against those who would destroy it. An hour later, Sarah found herself crouched behind a boulder on a hillside overlooking their back trail, watching as Jake rode toward their pursuers under a white flag. Charlie and Miguel had taken the herd into a protective circle in the valley below, ready to move quickly if the plan went wrong. Through her field glasses, Sarah could see that their followers were indeed Morrison's men, 4 riders including Frank Morrison himself. She watched as Jake approached their position, his hands clearly visible and away from his weapons. The conversation below was too distant for her to hear, but she could see the gestures and body language. Jake was calm and respectful, offering them a chance to state their business openly. Frank Morrison was gesturing angrily, clearly agitated by Jake's direct approach. Then, everything happened at once. Frank made a grab for his gun, apparently deciding to end the confrontation with violence. But Jake had been expecting treachery. He threw himself sideways out of his saddle just as Frank's shot rang out, rolling behind a rock outcropping as the other Morrison riders opened fire. That was Sarah's cue. She stood up on the hillside, clearly visible to the men below, and fired 3 shots into the air, the signal for Charlie and Miguel to bring the cattle up at a run while she provided covering fire for Jake. The Morrison men found themselves caught between Jake's position and Sarah's rifle, with 80 head of angry cattle bearing down on them from below. In frontier country, few things were more terrifying than a cattle stampede, and the sound of thundering hooves was enough to spook the Morrison horses. "That's enough." Ben Morrison's voice carried clearly across the valley as he emerged from behind a ridge with 2 more men. "Cease fire. All of you." The shooting stopped, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Ben rode down into the valley, his face dark with anger. "What's the meaning of this, Sullivan?" Ben demanded as Jake emerged from cover, his gun drawn but not pointed at anyone. "I might ask you the same question, Morrison," Jake replied calmly. "We're conducting legitimate business, moving cattle to market. You're the one following us with armed men. This is my country, and I have a right to know what's going on in it. Actually, this is public land, and we have every right to use it for legal purposes." Sarah rode down from her position on the hill, her rifle still ready but not directly threatening. "The question is, why are you so interested in preventing us from taking our cattle to market?" Frank Morrison looked furious, his gun still in his hand. "You ambushed us. You shot first, Jake pointed out. We just defended ourselves. Ben Morrison looked around at the situation. His men were outnumbered and outflanked, the cattle were under control, and he had no legal justification for stopping them. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, Sarah said firmly. Ben, I want you to understand something. I'm not the helpless widow you think I am. I have good men working with me, I have a legitimate business, and I have every right to defend what's mine. If you try to interfere with us again, I'll file complaints with the territorial marshal. You think the law will help you? I have influence in this territory that you can't match. Maybe, Jake said quietly. But, you don't have the moral authority. Everyone in this territory knows the difference between right and wrong, between helping a neighbor and trying to steal from a widow. Which side do you think people will choose if this becomes public? For the first time, Ben Morrison looked uncertain. In frontier communities, reputation and public opinion mattered enormously. If word spread that he was using underhanded tactics to steal a widow's land, it could damage his standing permanently. Come on, Ben said to his men. We're done here. As the Morrison riders withdrew, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. They had won this confrontation, but Jake was right, this wasn't really over until they reached Billings and proved that her ranch was viable. 2 days later, they crested a hill and saw the town of Billings spread out below them. The cattle pens at the railroad were visible in the distance, and Sarah could see smoke rising from the locomotives that would carry their beef to eastern markets. We made it, Charlie said with satisfaction. We made it, Sarah echoed, but her heart was racing with a different kind of anxiety now. Everything depended on the price they could get for their cattle. The cattle auction was held the next morning in a large pen beside the railroad tracks. Buyers from several eastern meat packing companies examined the cattle, making notes and discussing prices in low voices. Sarah stood beside Jake, trying to appear calm while her heart hammered in her chest. Everything she had worked for, everything she and Thomas had built together, came down to the next few hours. They look good, Jake said quietly. Healthy, well-fed, good size. We should get a fair price. The auctioneer began the bidding at $15 a head, and Sarah's heart sank. That was lower than she had hoped. But then, the bidding began in earnest, with buyers competing for the quality cattle they had brought to market. $16, $17, $18. I have $19, do I hear 20? The bidding continued, and, when the hammer finally fell, Sarah could hardly believe her ears. $22 a head for the entire lot. 83 head at $22, the auctioneer announced. Total sale, $1,826. Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. After expenses and Miguel's wage, they would clear almost $1,700, enough to make a substantial payment on the loan and prove to the bank that the ranch was viable. But, more than the money, more than saving the ranch, Sarah realized that they had proven something important about themselves. They had faced down bullies, overcome obstacles, and succeeded through hard work and partnership. That evening, as they prepared for the journey home, Jake found Sarah standing on the hotel balcony, looking out at the lights of the town. Regrets, he asked, joining her at the railing. About what? About any of it. The risk we took, the way we've changed your life, the fact that you're now a woman in business rather than a helpless widow. Sarah turned to face him, and, in the lamplight from the room behind them, Jake could see that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. The only regret I have, she said softly, is that it took almost losing everything to find out what I was really capable of. Jake pulled her into his arms. What are you capable of? Everything, Sarah whispered against his chest. I'm capable of everything I set my mind to, especially when I have the right partner beside me. Jake tilted her chin up so he could see her face. Sarah Matthews, will you marry me? The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it all the hopes and promises of their shared future. Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Yes, Jake Sullivan, I will marry you. I will be your partner in everything, business and life, dreams and reality, whatever comes our way. As Jake kissed her under the Montana stars, Sarah realized that the storm that had brought him to her door had been the beginning of the most important journey of her life. She had found not just love, but partnership, strength, and the courage to claim her own destiny. The train whistle echoed across the prairie as they held each other close, and Sarah smiled at the sound. It was the sound of cattle heading to market, of dreams becoming reality, of a future that belonged to them both. 3 months later, Sarah and Jake were married in a ceremony attended by half the territory. Charlie Hawkins gave away the bride, and Miguel Santos played guitar at the reception. Even some of their former adversaries attended, recognizing that the couple represented the best of frontier values, courage, determination, and the belief that with hard work and partnership, anything was possible. Ben Morrison never made another offer on Sarah's land. Frank Morrison eventually left the territory, reportedly heading for California. And Sarah Sullivan, she had taken Jake's name, became known throughout Montana as one of the most successful ranchers in the region, a woman who had proved that strength and determination were not limited by gender. Years later, when their own children asked about how their parents had met, Sarah would tell them about the storm that brought their father to her door. But she would always end the story the same way: sometimes the best thing that can happen to you comes disguised as the worst. Your father appeared to be just a stranger seeking shelter from a storm. But he was actually the answer to every prayer I didn't even know I was praying. And Jake would add with a smile, and your mother appeared to be just a widow in need of help. But she was actually the strongest person I had ever met, and the love of my life. Together, they had built something that would last for generations, not just a successful ranch, but a partnership based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the unshakable belief that together, they could overcome any storm that came their way.